Welcome to the heart of this course, writing the BIP. Getting started is sometimes the hardest part of any project, and writing a behavior intervention plan often feels like a major project, especially when you first start writing them. This lesson takes you step by step through the process to make writing your BIP simple and efficient. There are 10 key components in an effective BIP. These key components include learner-specific information, the goal, target behavior definitions and baseline, hypothesis of function, antecedent interventions, skill development interventions, consequence interventions, response to target behavior, additional strategies and information, and measurement and monitoring procedures. Each of these components builds part of the instruction manual you are creating for an interventionist to address the target behaviors. The content of some of these components will depend on the context within which you plan to implement the BIP, the values of the interventionist, the unique needs of the learner, cultural factors of the learner and the learner's family, the requirements of the funder or your employer, and your personal values. Some of these areas are more standard than others. Over time, you will develop your unique writing style, but be diligent in ensuring you customize each plan for the individual learner. Use templates so you don't need to start from scratch each time, but avoid the temptation to create boilerplate plans. In my experience, I have seen 3 basic structures of BIPs: the antecedent framework, the topography framework, and the response class framework. The antecedent framework lists what to do when common antecedents show up, such as when presenting a difficult task or restricting access to preferred items. The plan includes prevention strategies or antecedent interventions, skill acquisition interventions, and consequence interventions for each of the common antecedents. This framework provides staff with a quick reference, but it can be difficult for staff to remember which strategies to use in each situation. There is also often a lot of redundancy in the plan, as the same intervention may be used across different contexts in slightly different ways. For example, you might use the Premack principle when presenting a difficult task or when restricting access to preferred items or activities. The topography framework provides antecedent, skill development, and consequence interventions for each topography of behavior. This is probably the most difficult framework for staff to implement, as they have to anticipate what behavior might come up in order to use the prevention strategies. If different consequence interventions are used for each topography of behavior, this can feel overwhelming for staff. If the same interventions are used, the plan becomes redundant. The framework that I use is the response class framework. I identify all target behaviors that are part of the same response class or serve the same function. I use one intervention package to address all behaviors that are part of that response class. The plan that I will go through in this example uses this framework. The framework you choose depends largely on the requirements of your agency, the funder, your experience, and what makes the most sense for your interventionist. The behavior intervention plan must be specific to the learner for whom you write it. Include this information prominently at the top of the document and include the learner's name in the footer as well to ensure there is no confusion once you print the document. In this section, include identifying information such as the learner's date of birth and the supervising BCBA, as well as information that helps the audience understand important details. This information ensures that the audience knows who the plan is for and who wrote the plan. Your agency may require that you include other specific information. In addition to this information, you must include the learner's background information to provide a context that describes the factors that have influenced the behavior. Include details that help your audience understand your client more effectively. Include information about the learner's teacher or classroom, diagnoses, medical history, names of staff, allergies, preferences, trauma history, home environmental factors, intervention history. Consider including any other details that impact the effectiveness of your BIP or that your interventionist needs ready access to, or that helps explain the context of the behavior. Avoid making this section so robust that the reader struggles to pull out the critical information, but provide the information needed to implement the plan with fidelity. Goals are an important part of any successful ABA program. Goals give direction as well as a destination. They allow you to note progress or recognize a need for change. One of my favorite quotes is by Lawrence J. Peters, which says, "If you don't know where you're going, you will probably end up somewhere else." Setting goals allows you to measure the success of your BIP. Without a written goal, there is no way for you to determine if your interventions were effective. There are many strategies available for defining goals. The SMART technique is a framework that you have probably heard before and incorporates key elements of successful goals. SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Here are some examples. Sammy will have no more than 3 instances of aggression per week by September 1st. Richard will reduce target behaviors by 50% by January 1st. To improve Christian's ability to interact with peers and participate in DTT session and classroom activities with a 20% reduction in the frequency, intensity, and duration of flopping by March 31st. Notice how each of the example goals provides some way to measure the behavior along with a deadline. These components are critical to determining your success. Operational definitions ensure that anyone reading the plan clearly recognizes when the behavior occurs and when it does not. When your definitions are unclear, your data becomes questionable. Include these 3 components when writing your definitions: description of the behavior, examples, and non-examples. You defined target behaviors when you conducted your behavioral assessment, but now is the time to fine-tune them to be very specific to your learner. Here's an example of eloping. Eloping, any instance of Justin moving away from a supervising adult more than 5 feet while outside or inside when directed to go to a different location. Examples include going across the room when directed to go to the table, going down the hall toward the big clinic room when directed to go to the bathroom. Non-examples include going across the room to get a toy from the shelf during choice time, running in circles around the structure in the motor room during choice time. This definition is clear in that eloping only occurs when James is farther than 5 feet away from the adult and he has been directed to go somewhere else. If both of these conditions aren't present, then James did not elope. During your FBA, you should have collected baseline data for each target behavior. Include these data in your behavior plan. You can include them with your operational definition or in a chart where future progress will be reported. The hypothesis of function section comes directly from the results of your behavioral assessment. If you conducted a functional analysis, report that here. By testing any hypotheses through an FA or PFA, you can title this section the identified function. If you conducted an FBA, this section should include hypothesis in the title. The difference lies in the confidence with which you can state the function of the target behavior. The hypothesis of function section should be a simple statement that describes the most prevalent maintaining variables. Here's an example. Based on observations, data collected, and an interview with Kendra, Justin's mother, Justin's target behaviors are multiply maintained by escape from task demands and access to tangible. Justin is most likely to engage in target behaviors to escape tasks he perceives as difficult and will also attempt to access his iPad. Antecedent interventions help reduce the likelihood of maladaptive behavior occurring. These interventions create an environment that supports the learner's appropriate behavior. In this section, carefully write out the instructions for the interventionist, the person who will be implementing the plan. These should be step-by-step directions written in language that the interventionist can understand. Here's an example of instructions for implementing shared control. Make the examples specific to situations that relate to your learner. Shared control. Whenever possible, when presenting a demand to end or limiting access to a preferred activity, present Justin with 2 equally acceptable to the adult choices. For example, if you want him to put away the iPad, say, do you want to put it on the shelf or plug it into the charger? Or if he wants a cookie, say, You can't have a cookie, but you can have strawberries or pretzels. Which would you prefer? Skill development interventions help teach a functionally equivalent replacement behavior that results in the same reinforcer as the target behavior. Ensuring the functional equivalence of the replacement behavior is key to ensuring the success of your intervention. Often learners don't have the necessary prerequisite skills to utilize the desired behavior from the bottom row of the competing behavior pathway. Your skill development interventions provide an important first step while he develops the other skills he needs. Here's an example of instructions for implementing functional communication training. As with antecedent interventions, make the examples specific to situations that relate to your learner. Functional communication training. Justin uses his behavior as a means of communicating that he has an agenda that is different from yours. First, identify precursor behavior that may indicate he may engage in target behavior, including moving away, looking down, or specific facial expressions. Second, provide him with the words to express what you think he wants. For example, if a sibling grabs a toy from his hand, block his movement to take the toy back and say, my turn. Third, if he repeats something resembling what is prompted, honor his communication by giving him what he wants, provided that he is not engaged in target behavior. If he engages in target behavior, see below for appropriate responses and try FCT with him at another opportunity. Consequence interventions reinforce the ultimate desired behavior from the bottom row of the competing behavior pathway, while also reducing target behaviors. These interventions are most often a differential reinforcement procedure or some variant, but may be combined with other interventions such as token economy, behavior contracts, or group contingencies. Here's an example of instructions for implementing differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior. As with other interventions, make sure the examples are specific to your learner and what the interventionist is likely to encounter. DRL. Justin engages in the desired behavior, asking for help, too frequently to be acceptable in the classroom. Identify how often Justin engages in the behavior currently and set the goal just below that. For example, he currently asks for help 12 times when doing independent work. Set the initial criteria to earn reinforcement at 11 times. Allow Justin to choose from a menu of possible reinforcers. Visually present the goal. For example, 11 tally marks on a dry erase board or 11 pennies. Each time Justin engages in the behavior, for example, asking for help, remove one of the visual markers, such as the tally mark or a penny. If Justin has at least one visual marker remaining at the end of the identified time, provide him with praise and the identified reinforcer. Your BIP should provide clear guidance to your interventionist as to how they should respond to target behavior. Although some, or even all, of this information may be included in other sections, having a specific section for this may help ensure a clear understanding of expectations. In this section include the use or exclusion of extinction, the use or exclusion of response blocking, when and how to call for assistance, the use or exclusion of redirection, and any crisis procedures. Here's an example of how you might write the response to target behavior. Notice that this is simply a bulleted list. The interventionist should be able to quickly look at this section and know what they should do when target behavior arises. Withhold attention to the extent possible. For example, don't say Justin's name, do not make eye contact, etc. Monitor for safety. Use body positioning to minimize opportunities to elope from the room. Present the demands with visuals when possible. Wait for compliance with the demand. Resume reinforcement schedule only once the compliance has been reestablished. Additional strategies and information section is completely optional and dependent on the individual circumstances of your learner. This is the section for everything else you want to include in your BIP, but that doesn't fit into other sections. Include information that helps your interventionist understand your learner or interventions more thoroughly. Provide strategies related to common setting events, preference assessments, addressing behaviors not targeted in this plan, and research used in selecting interventions. Here's an example of how you might write the additional strategies section. Justin does best during structured activities where expectations are clear and tasks are well within his abilities. Provide Justin with a list of activities for him to choose from during unstructured time. Justin often engages in target behaviors when he struggles to regulate sensory input. Incorporate a variety of physically strenuous tasks, non-contingent on target behavior throughout his daily routine to help him meet his sensory needs. Include visuals and choice when presenting the expectation that he engage in these types of tasks. Include activities that he might find fun, such as an exercise ball, a medicine ball, parachute, or resistance bands. To help Justin regulate his activity level, follow sedentary or highly verbal activities with highly preferred sensory activities. For example, following circle time. After reading a book when he's seated on the floor listening to conversation, have Justin engage in a physically challenging activity or allow him to choose from the examples presented in the previous strategy. The measurement and monitoring section informs the reader how you plan to collect data and monitor the effectiveness of the plan. Include in your plan what data collection system will be used, who will collect the data, how will the plan be monitored, who will be responsible, how will team communicate, provide training, troubleshoot, ensure implementation, etc., and what strategies will support implementation, including fidelity checks, performance feedback, coaching, and team meetings. Here's an example of how you might write the measurement and monitoring section. This section does not need to be overly robust. It should provide sufficient information to let the interventionist know who is responsible for collecting data and how those data will be collected. Behavior data will be collected daily in Catalyst by the RBT. The BCBA will monitor the data, collect fidelity data, troubleshoot, and provide training and feedback to staff twice per week. The team will meet monthly to discuss progress, problem solve, and discuss changes to the plan to ensure continuity of implementation. In just a moment, I'm going to walk you through the process of developing a BIP from beginning to end. I will skip the step of conducting research since I went through that in the first lesson. I will go through the competing behavior pathway using an example of a behavior plan I wrote 6 years ago as an example. There are things in this plan that I would do differently now, given my experiences and what I have learned. After I go through the process, I will talk about what some of those things might be. While I walk through the process, think about one of your learners. How might the BIP look different if you use the competing behavior pathway to choose function-based interventions? Do the BIPs you currently write address all 10 key areas? What might you do differently to address the learner's needs in this plan? You can pause the video and download the BIP Notes document in the Resources tab if you want a place to answer these questions while watching the example. You can also share your thoughts in the discussion at the bottom of the page. This example is from a child that I used to work with. In this example, we're going to call him Christian. That's not his actual name. And some of the identifying information has been changed. But this is based on an actual child that I worked with a while back. I have this behavior intervention plan checklist. You'll be able to download this in the resources tab of the lesson. If you find this helpful, you can certainly download it. I have a sample VB map. This is just an example of what a VB map might look like for this particular learner. He has some manding skills. His listener skills are a little bit lower, and he does have some imitation skills as well. Those are important because a lot of the interventions, if you took the time to go through that interventions course in the last lesson, there are some prerequisite skills for some of the interventions. So those are really important to understand before you decide which interventions you're going to put into a behavior plan. I have some sample ABC data from this little boy. So that's just some of the information. We'll walk through an example of the sample data triangulation chart. I'll also have this available for you to download if this is something that you find helpful. It's just a way to put all of the information from the different sources together and can be a helpful intermediary step between data collection and your competing behavior pathway. Your source 1 is your ABC data. Source 2 is a scatter plot. And source 3 is your questionnaire. During an FBA, you want to make sure that you're collecting information from a variety of different sources. If you're doing a functional analysis, you don't need to worry about this specific document because you're going to have tested out your hypothesis, and so you'll have a better understanding of what actually the function of the behavior is. In this example, ABC data, the most common antecedents is denied access and demands. Also, the failure of staff to comply with his demands. In source 2, the most common antecedents are demands, again, especially during transitions away from preferred items or activities. Also, denied or limited access to preferred toys. In source 3, the questionnaire, demands and denied access to preferred toys are the most common antecedents. Most common consequences in source 1 is access to preferred items and delayed compliance with demands. So he gets to delay those task demands. Source 2, common consequences include access to preferred items. And in source 3, common consequences include delayed transitions and access to preferred items. So he's really good at getting access to those things that he likes. Now it's time to use this information to complete the competing behavior pathway. This is for Christian. So the most common setting events. For Christian, there really weren't a lot of setting events. Occasionally, new staff would make the behavior more likely to occur. But otherwise, he pretty much responded to everyone kind of the same. He would sometimes engage in behavior a little bit more when he was hungry. Most common behaviors. So if we were looking at the behaviors, we can look at tantrum happening a whole lot, almost every time. Biting also happening pretty frequently, and some scratching. So if we go back to the competing behavior pathway, tantrums, and they all kind of co-occurred. Biting and scratching. Most common consequence was access to preferred items and delayed demands. So now let's give this some thought. Our next step is to identify the replacement behavior. Christian, when he's denied access to his favorite items or activities, and when staff place demands, or when they fail to comply with his demands, he engages in tantrums in order to access preferred items and delay those demands. How, when these things come up, will we help him get to these consequences? We're going to use FCT because we want him to be able to ask for what it is that he wants. Access to preferred items and delayed demands. So this is where Greg Hanley's My Way protocol kind of falls in. He uses the My Way as an omnibus mand. So we're going to potentially teach him an omnibus mand because it's going to be too much for him to ask for the specific items that he wants and to ask for a delay. So we want him to be able to use a very simple mand for him to be able to access both of these things. That's why Greg Hanley uses My Way. So we'll use some sort of omnibus mand. It may not be My Way because he uses a communication device to communicate. So we'll have to give some thought as to what that's going to look like. All right, so setting events. What are we going to do when the most common setting events come up? So new staff, or he's hungry. So when these setting events are present, how will we adjust the environment or expectations to make him less likely to engage in the tantrums, biting, and scratching? We can reduce demands when new staff are present, or when he's hungry. We can extend time with preferred items. Now let's take a look at the antecedent interventions. When he's denied access, or there are demands placed, or when staff don't comply with his demands, what antecedent interventions can we put into place that will reduce the impact of these antecedents on his behavior? We could use the Premac principle to let him know when he's going to have access to those things that he likes. We could use schedules to show him, again, when he's going to have access to those things that he likes and to create some structure in his day. We might use some shared control. The desired behavior is for Christian to follow simple directions and we want him to accept some limits to those preferred activities that he likes so that he can complete simple tasks. Now, the consequence interventions. When the consequence interventions are intended to reinforce these desired behaviors. So what consequence interventions can we use to reinforce him following simple directions and accepting limits? DRA is probably the most beneficial consequence intervention for this. So we're going to reinforce cooperative behavior. We may also follow some more of Greg Hanley's protocol where they teach a tolerance response. That might be part of our skill development interventions, is to teach a tolerance response. Now you can see that we have kind of the basics of the competing behavior pathway. Let's take a look at the sample behavior plan that I have for him. This is actually the behavior plan, again, with all of the identifying information removed, but this is pretty much his behavior plan from when I worked with him a bunch of years ago. So you have your goal, and the goal for this is to improve Christian's ability to interact with peers and participate in DTT sessions and classroom activities with a reduction in the frequency, intensity, and duration of target behaviors by 80% by 7/1 to 2024. His target behaviors, we have biting. And again, operational definitions need to have kind of the body of the definition, your examples and your non-examples. These are really important pieces to your operational definition. A lot of people will skip the examples and non-examples, but it really helps for staff to have these here so that they know the behavior is actually occurring when it's not. It improves the accuracy of your data, and it's very helpful if you customize these to be things that are specific to your learner, examples that come up. We have the baseline data. So for him, biting occurred 3 times per hour during the initial assessment. We have scratching and pinching. And again, you have the body of the definition, you have your examples, and you have your non-examples. This has more examples than non-examples. For Christian, if he was scratching or pinching above somebody's clothing, we didn't count that. So I wanted to make sure to include that as a non-example, because in this definition, one of the keys is that it's another person's skin, not their clothing. That occurred 8 times per hour during the initial assessment. And then the final target behavior is tantrums. And this is a challenging behavior to describe because generally tantrums include multiple different topographies of behavior. And for Christian, he engages in 2 or more of the following behaviors at the same time, including aggression, crying, throwing, banging the floor, screaming, throwing, stomping, and or flopping. Because tantrums don't have a definitive beginning and end, we have the onset and the offset. Baseline data was 25 minutes per hour. So the hypothesized function, based on observations, ABC data, and interviews with staff, Christian's target behaviors are primarily maintained by access to tangibles. However, he also exhibits a strong MO to escape task demands. He wants to escape the task demands so that he can get back to playing with those toys that he really likes. Antecedent interventions, we included errorless learning in this one. We included the Premac principle, behavioral momentum, environmental modifications, Then we identified the replacement behavior, the skill development. So if you remember in our competing behavior pathway, the skill development intervention, this is the functionally equivalent replacement behavior. This is not the ultimately desired behavior. It's how is Christian going to get this reinforcer when these antecedents are present. We're going to use functional communication training. We're going to teach him a functional way to access those things that he wants. I would change this and use an omnibus mand. Consequence interventions. The consequence interventions, these again reinforces the ultimate desired behavior. For Christian, we decided to use DRO. This is not something that I often will recommend because it doesn't actually teach a skill or behavior. All it does is it reinforces the absence of behavior. Christian engaged in behaviors that were pretty scary to staff, and so we wanted to look to reduce his target behavior before we ultimately introduced DRA. We started with the DRO, and this is kind of what the description of the intervention looks like. It's pretty extensive, and it includes steps for changing the reinforcement criteria. He also had a token board. At the end of the 1 minute interval, he earned a token. And when he filled his token board, which was 5 tokens, so when he earned all 5 tokens, then he could trade in the reinforcer identified in the appropriate step. For every 5 minutes he's free of target behavior, he would earn 1 minute of reinforcement. We have the criteria to increase step and the criteria to decrease a step. In response to target behavior, this is really important, and I kept it as a bulleted list so that it was easy for staff to refer to. Additional strategies. So you can see that in this section, I'm providing a lot of very specific pointers for staff so that they know all of the different tips and tricks to get through a session with him with the least amount of target behaviors possible. Then we have the measurement and monitoring piece. This is the section where you're just kind of putting in the information about who's responsible for data collection and reviewing the data. So that's a really quick overview of this example BIP. I hope you have found this helpful. It's going to be available for you to download in the resources tab. As I have mentioned earlier, I have changed the way I write behavior plans over the years, as I have learned from leaders in our field and autistics that are speaking out about their experiences in ABA. The process of writing a BIP hasn't changed, but my decisions about the interventions to use are changing. When going through Christian's plan to remove identifying information, it was tempting to change some of the parts to more closely align with what I would choose now. But I wanted the opportunity to share my thoughts on these changes. The plan I just walked through was effective in reducing Christian's target behavior and reducing staff injuries caused by him. But there is always more than one way to address the needs of a learner. Here are some of the changes I would make now. I was taught that you must identify the function of target behavior, that is, the one singular variable that maintains the behavior. To be honest, this is something that I have always struggled with because I would see multiple variables that maintain behavior. In this example, I identified the function as escape and snuck in that he is also motivated to access his preferred items. Today, I will own the fact that I identify multiple functions of target behavior. Greg Hanley refers to this as synthesized reinforcement. Putting a name to it validated my perspective. In this example, Christian's behavior was maintained by escape from demands so that he could access those items he liked. The two functions are clearly linked, and it doesn't have to be just one or the other. Behavioral momentum is an effective intervention, but it's important to avoid using it in a manipulative way. Today, when I use behavioral momentum, I focus on the easy tasks being related to the end result in some way. For example, if I wanted him to sit at the table, I might have him put a toy that he's playing with in a basket, pick up the basket, and hop like a bunny to the table. I might make these a little silly, but they would still be related to the final demand, so I'm not just slipping it in at the end when he's not expecting it. As I suggested earlier, I would consider teaching Christian a single command that would result in him getting both escape from demands and access to the things he wants. Because the specific things he wanted varied, it was a bit ambitious to think we could teach him to effectively demand for the things he wants in a reasonable time frame while also struggling with his behavior. For the consequence intervention, I would now avoid the use of DRO and focus on using DRA and shaping to provide reinforcement for tolerating brief periods of demands and interruptions in his play. I would find a way for staff to join Christian while he played in a way that made staff's presence and attention valuable to him. This would provide the opportunity to encourage cooperation rather than demand it. I respond differently to challenging behavior than I did 6 years ago. I now understand that it's okay to soothe the child who is upset and that reintroducing a demand that triggered target behavior is not necessary. Yes, you run the risk of reinforcing the target behavior, but you maintain the trusting relationship and you can better prepare for the next time the learner experiences a triggering situation. This must be done carefully, with a clear understanding of the matching law and other behavioral principles at play. But it doesn't have to be as black and white as I once believed it did. Many of the additional strategies I feel are both compassionate and effective, so there aren't many things I would change in this section. Now, I rarely expect learners to sit at a table unless they choose to, and I use more naturalistic teaching strategies. I believe learning should be fun for everyone, and our clients are no different. Those of us working with children, they are often in school and then expected to participate in ABA sessions for 10, 20, 30, or even more hours per week. Our time with them should be filled with joy rather than forced compliance. Now I include information about assent in the additional strategies section. I teach my interventionists to look for signs of assent and ask them to pull back if they receive signs of assent withdrawal. I know it's been a long course, but you're almost done. Hang in there for just a little longer. The final step in the process that we have been discussing is to train staff and parents to implement the BIP. I'm not going to go into a deep dive about this, but unless you train someone to implement the plan, it's nothing more than a worthless piece of paper. Before you provide any training to parents or staff, it's important to build a partnership with them. Understand their values and priorities so that you can use the language that motivates them to implement the BIP with fidelity. We often make the assumption that when we write a plan, everyone will jump in and be excited to use these strategies. What we often fail to consider are the reinforcers available to the interventionist for implementing the BIP as written. We make the assumption that the expected change in the learner's behavior will motivate the interventionist. This is often not enough. Behavior change often happens slowly, and behavior may get more intense before it gets better. You must understand what motivates your interventionist before you begin training in order for your training to be truly effective. If you're interested in learning more about creating partnerships, we offer the Partnership Language 5-Day Challenge in the Master ABA Dojo, our membership. The course includes 2 general CEUs. I will provide a link in the Resources tab if you want to learn more. Once you have developed a partnership with your interventionist, you can use behavioral skills training to teach them to implement the interventions in the BIP. Behavioral skills training involves the following 4 steps: instruction, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback. During instruction, you provide detailed information about how to implement each of the interventions included in the BIP. Use language that is easy for the interventionist to understand and include examples as often as possible. Break down each intervention into its component steps and allow time for the interventionist to ask questions. After providing the basic instructions, model the implementation of the interventions. You can do this with the interventionist acting as the learner or with the learner themselves. This step can feel uncomfortable for many people, so go ahead and make it a little silly, especially at first, to break the ice. Rehearsal provides the interventionist with the opportunity to try out the different interventions in your plan. Again, it's okay to exaggerate a little in your acting, but make the situations as similar to what your interventionist will likely face as possible. The final step in BST is providing feedback. Give clear feedback to the interventionist about what they did well and what they might need more practice with. Go through each of the steps again as needed to review parts of the plan that the interventionist might need a bit more support with. Now that we've reached the end, you will have your final keyword. The last keyword is partnership. Again, the last keyword is partnership. Congratulations! You did it! You have reached the end of this course. Hopefully you have found these strategies helpful.